In Steve Urkel and Laura Winslow, the sitcom love story that made Family Matters famous, ABC turned relentless stalking into a multi-million-dollar punchline. But backstage, the reality was a psychological nightmare. To protect their cash cow, studio executives forced Jaleel White into a sick, legally binding contract. They banned him from the gym, forced him to shave his raw skin twice a day, and literally stunted his physical manhood until he was 22. Meanwhile, his co-star, Kellie Shanygne Williams, was stripped of her agency, forced to spend her most formative teenage years playing the helpless, silenced victim of normalized harassment. Together, these two teenagers were isolated on a toxic, resentful set, their human dignity quietly sacrificed for corporate greed. This is the unvarnished chronological story of how a television network prioritized a profitable caricature over human lives. In 1989, the American television landscape was undergoing a deliberate shift. The ABC network was building a dedicated block of family-friendly programming known as TGIF. Thank goodness it's Friday. They required wholesome, relatable content that families could consume together. To meet this demand, the network launched Family Matters, a spin-off from another successful sitcom, Perfect Strangers. The original blueprint for Family Matters was dignified, socially grounded, and highly anticipated by its cast. It was designed to focus squarely on the Winslows, a middle-class working black family living in Chicago. The show was anchored by Carl Winslow, a hard-working police officer, and his sharp, pragmatic wife, Harriet. The narrative was meant to explore the relatable, everyday struggles of raising children in urban America. For 13-year-old Kellie Shanygne Williams, booking the role of Laura Winslow was supposed to be the beginning of a prestigious acting career. Raised in Washington, D.C., Williams had an extensive background in children's theater. She was a serious, dedicated young actress who viewed Family Matters as an opportunity to portray a smart, ambitious, and well-rounded black teenager on national television. In the early episodes, Laura Winslow was exactly that. She was an A student, a cheerleader, and a daughter navigating the standard hurdles of adolescence. Williams was proud of the representation. The show had a clear, grounded identity, and the actors believed they were building a television legacy rooted in reality. A few miles away in Los Angeles, 12-year-old Jaleel White was navigating the unpredictable world of child acting. White had been acting in commercials since the age of 3. He was a professional, hard-working kid who had experienced his fair share of near misses, including filming a pilot for The Cosby Show, only to be replaced before the series aired. He was looking for his next job, completely unaware that his next audition would permanently alter the trajectory of his life and body. Midway through the first season of Family Matters, the writers encountered a minor narrative problem. They needed a one-time guest character to act as a foil for a single episode. The script called for a nerdy, socially inept boy to take Laura Winslow on a disastrous date. Jaleel White walked into the audition room wearing a pair of his father's oversized aviator glasses with the lenses popped out. He pitched his voice into a high nasal whine, hiked his trousers up to his chest, and delivered a highly eccentric physical comedy routine. The casting directors laughed. He was hired for what was explicitly intended to be a single week of work. When episode 12, Rachel's Place, was filmed in front of a live studio audience, a collision occurred that immediately rewrote the future of everyone involved. Jaleel White, dressed in bright suspenders and oversized saddle shoes, walked through the Winslow's kitchen door. He delivered his lines with a bizarre, jerky cadence. The studio audience's response was not just positive, it was seismic. The physical comedy and the sheer bizarre nature of the Steve Urkel character electrified the room. Every time he interacted with Williams, whose character reacted with natural, grounded annoyance, the audience roared. Television executives, men who dealt strictly in viewership metrics and advertising revenue, sat in the booths above the soundstage and watched the numbers. They saw the audience reaction. They recognized immediately that this one-off character was an anomaly that could generate massive returns. Artistic integrity and the original premise of a grounded family drama were instantly discarded. The executives bypassed the showrunners and ordered the writing staff to insert Steve Urkel into every subsequent episode. Within a matter of weeks, White was elevated from a temporary guest star to a permanent cast member. The structural foundation of Family Matters was entirely dismantled. It transformed rapidly from an ensemble drama about the Winslow family into an industrial machine designed to deliver Steve Urkel punchlines. This abrupt corporate pivot had an immediate, devastating impact on Kellie Shanygne Williams. She had signed a contract to play a multifaceted teenager. Suddenly, as the scripts for the second season rolled in, she realized her character was being systematically erased. Laura Winslow's ambitions, her school life, and her normal teenage problems were pushed completely into the background. Her new permanent job on the set was simply to react to Jaleel White. The dynamic the studio explicitly engineered between Urkel and Laura was established immediately. The writers made Urkel's unrequited obsessive love for Laura the central, driving plot of the entire franchise. For Williams, this meant showing up to work every day to play a target. She had to stand on her mark while her co-star invaded her character's personal space, destroyed her family's property, and ruined her fictional social life. Her dialogue was stripped down to exasperated sighs and a single repetitive command, "Go home, Steve." At 14 years old, Williams found herself trapped in a frustrating professional loop. She was an actress capable of delivering genuine emotional depth, but the network only required her to look annoyed. She was the straight woman to a clown, forced to watch as the nuanced show she thought she was making was replaced by cheap slapstick. Simultaneously, Jaleel White was experiencing a completely different type of trap. At 12 years old, he thought he had hit the jackpot. He had secured a permanent role on a hit network television show. He was earning a substantial salary and receiving bags of fan mail. He was a kid having fun, executing a silly voice and wearing a ridiculous costume. He did not realize that the network executives were already drafting legal contracts that would bind him to that exact physical appearance. He did not know that the suspenders and the high-pitched voice were not just a costume for a season, but a permanent uniform that he would be forced to wear long into his adult life. By the end of 1990, the trap was fully set. The ratings for Family Matters exploded, cementing its place as the anchor of the ABC Friday night lineup. The network was printing money, but on the sound stage, the two teenagers responsible for this massive wealth were being pushed into highly restrictive, unnatural roles. One was being conditioned to ignore the natural aging process, and the other was being conditioned to accept professional marginalization. The executives had successfully manufactured a sitcom phenomenon, completely indifferent to the fact that they were building it by stifling the growth of the two young humans at its center. As the calendar turned from 1990 to 1991, the ABC network had officially struck gold. Family Matters transformed into a cultural juggernaut, entirely propelled by the suspender-wearing phenomenon known as Urkel mania. Jaleel White's face was suddenly everywhere. He was on millions of lunchboxes, starring in nationwide advertising campaigns, and even had his own brand of breakfast cereal, Urkel Os. The financial windfall for the network and the studio was staggering, but beneath the massive revenue streams and the glossy magazine covers, a deeply troubling narrative was being systematically cemented into the foundation of the show. The studio writers, under strict directives from the executives, spent the second and third seasons carefully engineering a dynamic that normalized highly toxic behavior. The central comedic engine of the entire franchise relied entirely on Steve Urkel's relentless, boundary-breaking obsession with Laura Winslow. When you strip away the bright 1990s aesthetic and the upbeat theme music, the scripts were objectively disturbing. Urkel routinely broke into the Winslow home. He pitched tents on their front lawn to monitor Laura's movements. He actively sabotaged her dates with other young, respectful men, employing manipulation, guilt, and occasionally physical traps to isolate her. For Kellie Shanygne Williams, who was now 15 years old, this creative direction was a professional and psychological dead end. She had signed on to play a smart, ambitious black teenager navigating high school. Instead, her character was stripped of all agency and reduced to a singular function: the prey. Laura Winslow explicitly told Steve Urkel no in almost every single episode. She expressed genuine anger, discomfort, and distress at his constant surveillance and unwanted physical advances. Yet the television machine actively undermined her boundaries. The producers utilized the powerful psychological tool of the live studio audience and canned laugh tracks to manipulate the viewers at home. Every time Urkel ignored Laura's clear rejection, every time he ruined her privacy or forced an unwanted kiss, the applause sign flashed, and the audience roared with laughter. The narrative consistently framed Urkel as the sympathetic, lovable underdog whose relentless pursuit was noble, while framing Laura as a stubborn, cold prize who simply needed to be worn down. Williams found herself trapped in a masterclass of marginalized female agency. Week after week, year after year, she was paid to stand in front of millions of young viewers and demonstrate a highly damaging lesson. A woman's consent does not matter if the man pursuing her is persistent enough. The psychological weight of embodying this message took its toll. She was a talented actress restricted to rolling her eyes and delivering variations of the same line. Go home, Steve. While the network actively taught an entire generation of teenagers that stalking was simply a quirky form of romance. While Williams was being narratively suppressed, the workplace environment around her was rapidly deteriorating. The veteran cast members of Family Matters were profoundly insulted by the hijacking of their show. Highly respected actors like Jo Marie Payton, Reginald VelJohnson, and Thelma Hopkins had agreed to star in a dignified, grounded sitcom about a working-class family. By 1992, they realized they had been permanently demoted to background extras on their own set. Their rich, complex storylines were scrapped to make room for Urkel's slapstick routines and his bizarre science fiction inventions. A deep, freezing resentment permeated the sound stages. The adult actors made no secret of their disdain for the creative direction. The atmosphere between action and cut was thick with hostility. The veteran cast felt betrayed by the network, and their frustration naturally, if unfairly, bled into their interactions with the teenager who was the face of their marginalization. Jaleel White and Kellie Shanygne Williams were caught directly in the crossfire of this highly toxic workplace. At 15 and 16 years old, they were isolated. White was earning millions of dollars and carrying the entire financial weight of the ABC Friday night lineup. But he felt the icy reception from his older co-stars every time he walked onto the set. He was deeply disliked by the adults who viewed him as the symbol of their ruined show. Williams was in an equally impossible position. She respected the veteran actors and shared their frustration about the loss of the show's original premise. But her screen time and her career were now permanently, inextricably tethered to Jaleel White. The two teenagers formed a separate, highly profitable island in the middle of a very unhappy set, surrounded by angry adults and demanding corporate bosses. Then, in 1993, the ABC network encountered an inescapable crisis. Jaleel White turned 17. The creepy, persistent nerd routine was somewhat palatable to audiences when Steve Urkel was a small, prepubescent child. The physical mismatch between the tiny, squeaky-voiced boy and the exasperated teenage girl played as a harmless gag. But the biological reality of human growth is a relentless force. White was a young black man experiencing puberty. He was producing testosterone, his shoulders were broadening, and his natural voice was dropping into a deep, resonant baritone. He wanted to exercise, to build muscle, and to look attractive, just like any normal teenager. A grown, physically mature man relentlessly stalking a woman, breaking into her house, and refusing to accept her rejection is no longer a sitcom trope. It is a terrifying reality that audiences would immediately reject. The network executives looked at their maturing lead actor and panicked. They looked at the hundreds of millions of dollars in syndication and advertising revenue that depended entirely on the Urkel caricature, and they made a swift, clinical decision. Instead of allowing the character to mature, to learn boundaries, or to grow up, they decided to freeze Jaleel White in time. The studio intervened with absolute authority, utilizing strict appearance clauses in his contract to lock him into a physical cage. The executives explicitly prohibited White from working out or lifting weights. They required him to remain unnaturally skinny, ensuring he maintained the weak, unthreatening physical profile of a 12-year-old boy. His own biological development became a literal liability to his employment. As he entered his late teens and naturally began to grow facial hair, the biological suppression became intimately invasive. The producers ordered him to shave twice a day, every single day he was on set, to maintain the completely smooth, childlike face the audience expected. For a young black man, shaving with that level of frequency often causes severe skin irritation, razor bumps, and painful ingrown hairs. White was forced to drag a razor across raw, bleeding skin between takes. It was a physical manifestation of the network, forcing him to violently erase his own adulthood. The wardrobe and sound departments functioned as the final locks on his cage. The costume designers forced him into oversized, brightly colored shirts, specifically tailored to hide his broadening frame. They strapped him into painfully tight, highly restrictive suspenders designed to pull his trousers high above his waist, altering his natural center of gravity and forcing a hunched, awkward posture. Most painfully, he was forced to artificially pitch his voice up to a damaging, high-pitched squeal, sustaining that unnatural nasal vocal register for 10 to 12 hours a day, year after year, placed an immense, agonizing strain on his vocal cords. His throat ached constantly. The entire television system was actively, physically punishing him for growing up. By 1994, the two stars of Family Matters were living inside parallel prisons. Kellie Shanygne Williams was 18 years old, a young woman trapped creatively, forced to play the perpetual victim of harassment in a script that refused to let her fight back or move on. Jaleel White was 18 years old, a young man trapped physically, forced to endure raw skin, aching vocal cords, and a prohibited gym membership just to maintain the illusion of a prepubescent boy. They were both globally famous. They were both highly paid. But as they entered young adulthood, they had been systematically stripped of their basic human dignity by a corporate machine that valued a cartoonish laugh far more than the actual people generating it. By 1995, the internal pressure cooker on the set of Family Matters had reached critical mass. Jaleel White and Kellie Shanygne Williams were 19 years old. They had spent the entirety of their defining teenage years locked inside a corporate terrarium, strictly monitored and heavily manipulated by a network that refused to let them age. But biology is stubborn, and human dignity has a breaking point. White, exhausted by the daily physical pain of raw skin from constant shaving, the agonizing strain on his vocal cords, and the psychological humiliation of being a grown man forced to play a prepubescent caricature, finally pushed back. He approached the producers with a desperate plea for relief. He needed to breathe. He needed to use his actual voice. He needed the world to know that underneath the high-water trousers and oversized glasses, he was a mature, capable young man. The network executives, terrified of losing their primary cash cow, realized they had to offer their exhausted star a compromise or risk a total burnout. Their solution was not to retire Steve Urkel, nor was it to allow the character to naturally mature. Instead, in a bizarre narrative pivot, they introduced a sci-fi cloning chamber to the script. Urkel stepped into the machine and emerged as his genetically altered alter ego, Stefan Urkel. For Jaleel White, the creation of Stefan was a profound visceral relief. For the first time in 6 years, the heavy restrictive suspenders were unclipped. The oversized, brightly colored shirts were replaced with tailored suits and leather jackets that actually fit his adult frame. He was allowed to stand up straight, correcting the hunched, unnatural posture he had been forced to maintain for over half a decade. Most importantly, he was permitted to drop the nasal squeal. When Stefan Urkel spoke, audiences finally heard Jaleel White's actual voice, a smooth, resonant, natural baritone. For a few episodes a season, the actor was granted brief, fleeting moments of basic human dignity. He was allowed to be handsome. He was allowed to be a man. However, this corporate compromise came with a devastating catch, and the collateral damage fell directly onto the shoulders of Kellie Shanygne Williams. The introduction of Stefan Urkel fundamentally altered the trajectory of Laura Winslow, and not for the better. The writers immediately manufactured a love triangle between Laura, Steve, and Stefan. Suddenly, the smart, ambitious, boundary-setting young woman that Williams had worked so hard to build was drastically rewritten. When Stefan appeared, the scripts demanded that Laura completely lose her composure. She was written to swoon, to beg for his attention, and to tolerate his newfound arrogance simply because he was physically attractive. This creative direction was a profound insult to Williams's character. It stripped Laura Winslow of her established intelligence and reduced her to a shallow, superficial trope. The network was implicitly broadcasting another highly toxic message to its young audience. Laura only valued the man when he completely erased his original personality and changed his physical appearance. Williams was forced to navigate this narrative whiplash every week. She had to act repulsed by Jaleel White in one scene, and then act desperately, cartoonishly infatuated with him in the next, simply because he changed his wardrobe and lowered his voice. Her agency was entirely compromised, trapped in a bizarre psychological ping-pong match with two versions of the exact same actor. As the mid-1990s progressed, the show completely lost its grip on reality. To keep the Urkel machine running, the network writers abandoned the grounded, working-class family roots entirely. Family Matters mutated into an absurd science fiction comedy. The scripts featured Steve and Laura shrinking down to microscopic size, traveling back in time to pirate ships, and eventually launching into outer space. This descent into absolute absurdity broke the veteran cast. The adults who had signed on to make a dignified show about a black family in Chicago watched as their legacy was turned into a weekly circus act. The resentment on the set transformed into open mutiny. Jo Marie Payton, the highly respected actress who played the matriarch Harriet Winslow, reached her absolute limit. She watched the scripts devolve into cloning and jetpacks, looked at the toxic, fractured environment of the soundstage, and made a stunning professional decision. In 1997, halfway through the show's final season, Payton quit. She walked away from one of the highest-rated shows on television and a massive salary simply to reclaim her artistic integrity and escape the circus. The departure of the family matriarch was a devastating blow to the morale of the remaining cast. Jaleel White and Kellie Shanygne Williams were now in their early 20s, wealthy but completely professionally isolated, left to steer a sinking ship. White was being pushed to the brink of total physical collapse. To keep the ratings up, the network was now forcing him to play up to 3 different characters in a single episode: Steve, Stefan, and Steve's female cousin, Myrtle Urkel. He was spending hours in the makeup chair, switching between heavy prosthetics, drag, and suspenders, running back and forth between sets until he was entirely depleted. Years later, he would confess to hiding in his dressing room, breaking down in tears from the sheer crushing exhaustion of carrying an entire network franchise while feeling completely alienated from his angry, resentful co-stars. Then came 1998, the 9th and final season. The ABC network, recognizing that the ratings were finally starting to slip and the actors were too old to sustain the illusion, decided it was time to cash out. But before they shut down production, the executives demanded a definitive, highly marketable climax. They mandated the ultimate payoff for their 9-year investment. They demanded that Laura Winslow finally surrender to Steve Urkel. Not the suave, handsome Stefan, but the suspender-wearing, boundary-breaking Steve. The writers executed the mandate with clinical precision. In the show's final arc, Laura experiences a sudden, unearned epiphany. After 9 years of explicitly rejecting his advances, changing her locks and demanding he leave her alone, she realizes she is deeply in love with her stalker. The series concludes with Steve Urkel proposing to Laura Winslow and Laura joyfully accepting. For Kellie Shanygne Williams, it was the ultimate forced surrender. She had to stand under the studio lights, look at the man who had narratively harassed her character for nearly a decade, and deliver a tearful, romantic yes. They kissed. The canned audience track erupted into rapturous applause, and the camera stopped rolling for the last time. It was a horrifying cultural crescendo. The network had successfully delivered their fairy tale ending, completely ignoring the fact that they had just validated nearly a decade of predatory behavior. They taught millions of viewers that no is just a temporary obstacle, and that relentless harassment is simply the prelude to a wedding ring. The study, executives collected their final syndication checks, dismantled the Winslow kitchen set, and walked away without a second thought for the 2 young adults they were leaving behind in the wreckage. In the summer of 1998, Jaleel White and Kellie Shanygne Williams walked off the Warner Brothers lot as 22-year-olds. The golden handcuffs were finally unlocked. They had spent their entire adolescence and the dawn of their adulthood in a heavily monitored corporate cage. They were multimillionaires, and they were entirely, irrevocably traumatized by the machine that had built their fortunes. They stepped into the harsh sunlight of the Los Angeles entertainment industry, desperate to reclaim their stolen identities. But the real world is incredibly cruel to former child stars, especially those who were forced to be caricatures. As they began to audition for new mature roles, they quickly realized that the network had not just bought their teenage years. The network had permanently purchased their faces. The true, agonizing psychological aftermath of Family Matters was only just beginning. In the autumn of 1998, the Warner Brothers sound stages were finally quiet. The Winslow family living room, the site of 9 years of relentless television production, was dismantled and placed into storage. Jaleel White and Kellie Shanygne Williams were 22 years old. They had spent the entirety of their adolescence functioning as highly paid employees for a massive corporate machine. They were young, wealthy, and officially unemployed. The immediate aftermath of a long-running sitcom is often portrayed as a liberating transition for young actors, a moment to stretch their artistic muscles and take on bold new projects. But the reality for White and Williams was a brutal, jarring collision with a Hollywood system that had already decided their careers were over. The industry had not just purchased their teenage years, they had permanently purchased their faces. When Kellie Shanygne Williams began auditioning for new mature roles in the late 1990s, she collided with an impenetrable wall of typecasting. She was a beautiful, highly experienced, and talented 22-year-old actress, but casting directors simply could not look at her without seeing Laura Winslow. When she read for dramatic, complex roles, the directors waited for her to roll her eyes. They waited for her to deliver a sitcom punchline. The industry had trained the American public to view her exclusively as the exasperated object of Steve Urkel's obsession, and the industry itself fell victim to its own conditioning. Williams found herself in a deeply frustrating professional purgatory. She booked a recurring role on the sitcom What About Joan in 2000, but she quickly realized that the Hollywood establishment had no intention of allowing her to lead a dramatic project. They wanted to keep her in the safe, easily digestible comedy box. She was expected to be grateful for the wealth she had accumulated as a child, while quietly accepting that her serious artistic ambitions would never be taken seriously. The system that had stripped Laura Winslow of her agency was now actively attempting to strip Kellie Shanygne Williams of her future. Simultaneously, Jaleel White was executing a desperate, aggressive campaign to reclaim his own biology and his professional identity. The moment the Family Matters contracts expired, he immediately discarded the physical restrictions that had governed his entire adolescence. He stopped shaving his face twice a day, allowing a natural beard to grow. He walked into a gym, lifted weights, and built the athletic, muscular physique the network had explicitly forbidden him from having. He lowered his voice to its natural resonant baritone. He wanted to visually and audibly obliterate Steve Urkel. In 1999, White created and starred in a new sitcom for the UPN network titled Grown Ups. It was a deliberate, calculated move to present himself to the viewers, LD as a normal 20-something man navigating relationships and a career. He wore modern clothes, spoke with his real voice, and played a completely grounded character. But the American viewing public reacted with a strange, entitled hostility. The audience did not want a handsome, athletic Jaleel White. They felt betrayed that he was no longer the awkward, high-pitched caricature they had grown comfortable laughing at. The ratings plummeted, and Grown Ups was unceremoniously canceled after a single season. This cancellation was a devastating psychological blow. It confirmed White's darkest fears. The industry did not value his talent as a writer or a multifaceted actor. They only valued the intellectual property he had been forced to embody. He was a man in his early 20s who had generated billions of dollars for a major network, yet he was essentially blacklisted from serious leading roles. He could not walk down a street, enter a restaurant, or attend a professional meeting without someone asking him to pull up his trousers and say, "Did I do that?" The catchphrase became a heavy, suffocating chain around his neck. As the early 2000s progressed, the two former co-stars navigated their shared trauma in fundamentally different ways. They were bonded by a unique, highly specific experience that no one else on earth could truly understand. Yet they needed significant distance from the show and from each other to heal. Kellie Shanygne Williams looked at the shallow, rigged game of early 2000s Hollywood and made a profound, empowering decision. She refused to beg a broken system for validation. Instead of staying in Los Angeles and fighting a losing battle against typecasting, she packed her bags and left California entirely. She moved back to the East Coast, returning to her roots in the Washington, D.C. area. This relocation was not a retreat. It was a powerful reclamation of her own agency. She took the massive wealth she had generated during her sitcom years and funneled it into something real and impactful. In 2006, she founded the Kellie Williams Program, an initiative designed to provide students in the Washington, D.C. area with the opportunity to produce television programs to air on local cable. She transitioned from being a pawn in a network executive's game to becoming a mentor, a producer, and a quiet powerhouse in her own community. She married, started a family, and built a deeply fulfilling life entirely outside the toxic radius of the Hollywood machine. She survived the industry by walking away from it on her own terms, securing the peace and respect the sound stages had denied her. Jaleel White chose to stay and fight. He refused to let the industry discard him. He enrolled at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, and earned a degree in film and television. He wanted to understand the machinery from the inside out, transitioning into writing, producing, and directing. He took on small, diverse acting roles, guest spots on dramas, voiceover work, and independent films, methodically attempting to chip away at the Urkel monolith. But the 2000s and early 2010s were a brutal era for a former child star trying to rebrand. The rise of the internet and social media meant that Family Matters was constantly circulating in syndication and memes. The culture continuously dragged him back to the 1990s. He was repeatedly subjected to cruel internet death hoaxes, a bizarre phenomenon where the public seemingly treated him more like a disposable fictional character than a living, breathing human being. He endured decades of interviews where journalists ignored his current projects and relentlessly badgered him about a character he had not played since he was 22. He had to develop an incredibly thick skin, swallowing his frustration and maintaining a professional smile while the world refused to acknowledge his adulthood. Despite the physical miles between them and the different paths they chose, White and D. Williams were both engaged in the exact same quiet war. As they entered their 30s, they were doing the hard, unglamorous work of dismantling the psychological cages built by the ABC network. They had to learn how to exist as normal adults after spending their most formative years under intense artificial pressure. They had to unlearn the toxic dynamics of their fictional relationship and heal the genuine resentments born from the toxic workplace environment they had survived together. As the calendar moved deeper into the 2000s, a subtle but highly significant cultural shift began to occur. The rise of streaming platforms fundamentally altered the way society consumed classic television. A new generation of viewers, armed with a more critical understanding of media, began to binge-watch Family Matters. When watched in rapid succession, uncoupled from the weekly broadcast schedule, the canned laughter lost its manipulative power. Stripped of this comedic camouflage, the true nature of the Steve and Laura dynamic was completely exposed. Cultural critics and everyday viewers looked past the slapstick routines and collectively recoiled at the narrative, pointing out a deeply uncomfortable truth. Steve Urkel was a relentless stalker, and Laura Winslow was his hostage. This retrospective cultural awakening provided a profound delayed vindication for Kellie Shanygne Williams. For decades, the cultural narrative had painted her character as a stubborn, stuck-up girl who was unfairly mean to a sweet, nerdy boy. But the 2010 audience finally saw exactly what she had been forced to play. They recognized the genuine distress in her performance. They saw a young, intelligent black woman who repeatedly established clear boundaries, only to have the adults in her fictional world and the adults running the television network actively encourage her harasser. The public finally acknowledged the immense restrictive burden the script had placed upon her, and they began to praise the quiet, grounded dignity she brought to an otherwise absurd, chaotic production. Simultaneously, the modern critical reevaluation offered a new, profound level of professional respect for Jaleel White. While the character's behavior was widely condemned by modern standards, the sheer, undeniable athletic feat of White's acting was finally recognized for what it was. Critics and peers began to acknowledge the incredible stamina, the razor-sharp comedic timing, and the immense physical toll required to execute that level of physical comedy for 9 years. They looked at the episodes where he seamlessly transitioned between Steve, Stefan, and Myrtle Urkel in a single scene, and they finally admitted the truth. He was not a one-trick pony. He was a highly disciplined, deeply talented comedic force who had simply been trapped in a corporate box. As the culture began to offer them this delayed respect, White and Williams were both entering their 40s. Time, geographical distance, and the shared understanding of their unique survival had done the slow, quiet work of healing the wounds inflicted by the ABC network. Jaleel White had successfully navigated the brutal transition from child star to working adult actor. He stopped fighting the shadow of his past and learned how to strategically leverage it. He built a robust career in voice acting, most notably voicing the iconic video game character Sonic the Hedgehog for years, and secured steady, mature roles in major television dramas and independent films. But his most brilliant move was a masterclass in reclaiming his own intellectual property. In 2021, White officially entered the rapidly expanding legal cannabis industry. He partnered with a prominent company to launch his own line of cannabis products. The name of his brand was It's Purple, featuring a highly sought-after strain of marijuana, known in the culture as Purple Urkel. It was a genius, fiercely independent business maneuver. He took the exact naming, E and the cultural footprint that the network had used to keep him in a prepubescent cage, and he monetized it as a mature, adult businessman operating in a strictly adult industry. He completely destroyed the sanitized, family-friendly innocence of the character, reclaiming his brand on his own terms and generating his own wealth, entirely free from the executives who had once dictated his shaving schedule. Kellie Shanygne Williams, meanwhile, had achieved the ultimate quiet victory over the Hollywood machine, absolute apathy towards its validation. She had built a fortress of a life in Washington, D.C. She was a dedicated mother, a respected wife, and a pillar of her local community. She ran her educational initiatives using her massive platform and her corporate knowledge to teach young people how to navigate the media landscape safely. She occasionally accepted small acting roles or public speaking engagements, but she did so strictly on her own terms, completely insulated from the desperation and the toxic power dynamics of Los Angeles. She had survived a system designed to strip young women of their agency, and she emerged as a highly autonomous, empowered adult. In 2017, the entertainment magazine Entertainment Weekly orchestrated a formal reunion of the Family Matters cast. It was the first time the entire surviving ensemble had been gathered in a professional setting since the sound stages were dismantled in 1998. When Jaleel White and Kellie Shanygne Williams walked into the photography studio, they were no longer the isolated, exhausted teenagers fighting a corporate war. They were adults in their early 40s, bearing the scars and the wisdom of survivors. The photographs and interviews from that reunion are incredibly telling. The deep, freezing resentment that had once defined the set was gone. The veteran actors, including Jo Marie Payton, who had quit the show in protest, openly embraced White. They looked back at the 1990s not with anger towards E, other, but with a shared, sober understanding of the corporate pressure cooker they had all been forced into. When White and Williams sat down together for the cameras, there was a palpable, genuine warmth between them. They were the only two people on the planet who truly understood the specific crushing weight of carrying the TGIF lineup on their adolescent shoulders. The network had structurally pitted them against each other, the heavily favored, highly paid star against the marginalized, exasperated foil. But the adults sitting in that studio recognized that they had both been victims of the exact same executive greed. They had both been robbed of a normal adolescence. They laughed, they hugged, and they spoke of their shared history with the gentle, protective respect of war veterans. The television industry of the 1990s was a ruthless, unregulated frontier regarding the psychological welfare of its young stars. The executives at ABC and Warner Brothers looked at two talented black teenagers and saw nothing more than a highly efficient algorithm for printing money. They did not care that they were normalizing predatory behavior to an entire generation of young men. And they did not care that they were teaching young women that their boundaries were irrelevant. They cared exclusively about the Nielsen ratings and the advertising revenue. But the ultimate triumph of this story does not belong to the network. It belongs to the two human beings who outlived the machine. Kellie Shanygne Williams and Jaleel White took the massive wealth they earned in that toxic environment and used it to buy their freedom. They refused to succumb to the tragic, well-worn path of the Hollywood child star. They did not turn to self-destruction. They did not beg a broken system for scraps. And they did not let the resentment of their youth poison their adulthood. They fought their way out of the suspenders and the typecasting, doing the hard, quiet work of building dignified, independent lives. The American public tuned in every Friday night for 9 years to watch a highly orchestrated, highly profitable illusion. They laughed at the clumsy nerd. They cheered when he finally wore down the girl of his dreams, and they bought the merchandise that funded a corporate empire. But the true story of Family Matters was never the romance broadcast on the screen. The executives at ABC and Warner Brothers looked at two talented black teenagers and saw nothing more than a highly efficient algorithm for printing money. They normalized predatory behavior to a generation of young men, taught young women their boundaries were irrelevant, and physically stunted a young actor just to maintain a punchline. But the ultimate triumph of this story does not belong to the network. It belongs to the two human beings who outlived the machine. Kellie Shanygne Williams and Jaleel White took the millions earned in that toxic environment and bought their freedom. They walked through the fire of global fame, extreme isolation, and profound psychological manipulation, and emerged whole. They proved that while an industry that can purchase your childhood and temporarily hijack your image, it cannot permanently own your humanity. In the end, they left the soundstage behind and walked away into the real world, finally free to write their own unscripted, beautiful lives.